everyone. Welcome to the Identity Management and Zero Trust Summit. Today's event was organized by the hardworking folks at RedmondMag.com and Virtualization and Cloud Review, who have brought together some of the best independent experts on today's topic. Many thanks to our sponsors today, JumpCloud and Zoho, for making this event possible. And thanks to you for joining us. I am Gladys Rama. I'm the editorial director here in the Converge 360 group, and I'll be your moderator for the first of 3 information-packed sessions. But before we get started, we do need to go over a couple of housekeeping details. First, each of today's sessions is being recorded for later access, so keep an eye out for an email with a link to that recording. It'll be coming your way within the next few days. Second, each of today's sessions will be followed by a 5 to 10-minute Q&A. You can type your questions into the Q&A box at any time, so please feel free to add your questions as they occur to you throughout the summit, and we'll do our best to get to all of them. Third, our sponsors, JumpCloud and Zoho, have generously provided some extra resources for you that can be found on the right-hand side of your screen. So please take a moment to check those out, or if we're on a break between sessions, please do go ahead and access those resources for you. At the end of this summit, you'll be asked to take a very short survey, so please take a moment to share your honest opinions. We actually read every single comment, every single one of them, and I'm one of them who read them, so I know it's true. Your opinions help to shape our future events. And last but not least, at the end of the third session, one lucky attendee will be receiving an Xbox S Series and a 3-month Xbox Game Pass gift card. But you have to be present to win, so please stick around to the end of today's session. So now we can get started with our first session, Modern Identity Management Best Practices for Enterprises. For this session, I'm happy to introduce the speaker, Ian Thornton-Trump, Chief Information Security Officer at Cyjax. Ian is an ITIL certified IT professional with 25 years of experience in IT security and information technology. Besides serving with the Royal Canadian Mounted Police as a criminal intelligence analyst, Ian has also worked as a cybersecurity analyst, consultant for multinational insurance, banking, and regional healthcare. You're in for a great session, so sit tight. Take it away, Ian.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Gladys and Victoria. It's always my pleasure to be part of the fun when it comes to one of these Redmond Channel partner events. And I do want to thank the 2 sponsors, JumpCloud and Zoho, for their kind sponsorship, but also for providing me a lot of guidance and material on what I'm going to talk about. Now, as you can see, I've done a lot of things. I'm a big fan of cyber threat intelligence. It's a space that I work in, but I also like to have a lot of fun too, run a recording studio, an MSP, and I'm a member of the Beer Farmers. You can follow me online at fat_hobbit. So before we even begin, we really need to talk a little bit about zero trust and the saying, as opposed to the sort of marketing speak that is out there. So essentially, this was a follow-on from the never trust, always verify type of approach that we've been talking about in terms of a security framework for really quite some time. And I want to say that even though this approach, the zero trust approach, was sort of coined, if you will, by Stephen Paul Marsh in 1994. There's parts of it that are really, really relevant. And as a result of the research, a bit of a light went on in my head that I'm going to share with you guys as we get into this presentation a little bit further. But I will say this, that the global zero trust security market size is projected to grow at a 17.4 compound annual growth rate. That's exciting. It means a lot of businesses, a lot of investments are being made in zero trust, in quotations. We're going to get into what that actually means very shortly. But I want to say that this is something that businesses are exploring for a number of different reasons. I think from my perspective, when you combine things like compliance, digital transformation, the movement to public cloud, we have now extremely complicated challenges on the enterprise side. And I think where I see Zero Trust is more of an opportunity space in terms of actually being able to get organizations to the table and talk about a realistic phased approach, phased being really important, and strategy development to move towards a more secure infrastructure. So in a way, this is a framework that can't really be checkmark box compliance driven. This is almost, and I say the word, a philosophical change from the way we used to design networks and the way we used to design, I would say, access controls. But it's now taken to the next level where it's actually across a number of different areas that we're going to explore when we get into this. And I guess one of the things that was a bit insulting to me, at least, was when large companies come out and basically tell me the same thing that we've been trying to do since the 1970s, right? Zero Trust is about putting in place systems that help safeguard both the employees and the company. Well, I mean, if we haven't been doing that, I think one could say we reap what we sow. And as a result, we've seen a lot of data breaches, a lot of things that have happened to companies, be it fraud, be it social engineering attacks, business email compromise being one of the number one things that is taking money out of corporations, and of course the dreaded ransomware. So, I mean, it's all well and good to sort of now proclaim Zero Trust as being the new kid in town, but the actual reality is that, we've been trying this for a really long time, and I think now a lot of vendors have come out and have suggested that there are solutions in the marketplace now to realize that journey. But do not think for a moment that you just buy something and it becomes Zero Trust within your organization. I think that's one of the first fallacies when you look at Zero Trust. But I will say that I've been an outspoken member of the cybersecurity community when it came to Zero Trust, because I really, at the time that I wrote this, I really felt that it was, why are we taking something that was built in 1994 that was really based on the idea of building higher walls on your castle and wider and deeper moats in terms of trying to protect your data. And then, of course, the threat landscape from the 1994 to 2000 has totally changed from where we find ourselves today. And just recently, I responded to on LinkedIn someone that had posted the latest CISA guidance, basically saying, shields up, shore up your defenses and everything like that. And unfortunately, I believe it was a missed opportunity because a lot of the security controls they were talking about were not appropriate to the multi-factor SSO world that we're going to need to live in, because a whole bunch of the business apps, the things that we use to administer our company, even the things that we use to produce whatever it is our company produces, are not in your hands, which of course is an intrinsic problem with the whole idea of adopting Zero Trust. But as I've said, when you think about how you can start moving towards Zero Trust, I've done a number of these events kind of skirting around, what is Zero Trust, the Zero Trust Summit, in fact, Zero Trust and how it is a foundation for something called EUC, which is out of scope of today's presentation. But I put up good old Karl von Clausewitz here because he's got two sort of like sayings that I think are so appropriate to an enterprise company that is thinking of doing this journey. And the first is, everything in strategy is very simple, but that does not mean everything is very easy. That's sort of, something that when you talk about digital transformation within an organization is really appropriate. And also, strategy is about making choices on how we will concentrate our limited resources and achieve competitive advantage. So if we look at Zero Trust now as something that we're going to start adopting as a strategy within our organization, we need to understand that identity management, IDAM, if you want to call it, access control, role-based access control, RBAC, as the cool kids call it, the vital ground in your journey towards Zero Trust success is absolutely identity management. And I'm now going to go into depth about how I see Zero Trust and why IDAM becomes the thing that is most important that will set you up for success on all the other areas that will need to be addressed as you digitally transform your organization, but you decide that you're going to try your hand at implementing a Zero Trust framework. This is not inexpensive to do, by the way. This is a commitment of resources, time, and effort, and especially education. Education for all of the people that will be involved in this kind of project to get this right. Okay. So the curtains are back, and we stare at our first diagram. The first diagram that I have for you is all of the sum of the major components of Zero Trust as a model, right? Identity being at the start of this journey. Now, when I originally found this model to kind of present in this thing, I didn't think that there was sort of like I'm going to say a mini project plan within these icons. And it turns out, after reading a lot of the stuff that our sponsors provided, and make sure you do download those resources because they really set you on the right path for success. Identity is the first thing that you need to start addressing within your organization. Okay? And then endpoints, and then data management, and then applications, and then infrastructure, and then network. And there's all sorts of challenges along that journey. But believe it or not, when you're thinking about the Zero Trust model, the only thing that you have complete control over is identity and access management. Everything else is going to, at some point, rely on a manufacturer, a supply chain partner, a third-party application, co-hosted infrastructure, or even network connections that are going to generally be outside of the scope of the IT team. You know, I'm talking about layer one stuff. I'm talking about leased MPLS circuits and things like that, which are generally outside of the control, if you will, of the network team, as an example, okay? So let's get into it. So the first thing, absolute first thing when it comes to Zero Trust identity is account management within your organization. We're going to talk about that as a really important and key thing. The single source of identity of truth, what is that? Well, some would say that is the payroll system of your organization. So the payroll system of who's an employee, their compensation, usually there's a role, usually associated with that individual. All of that stuff needs to be squared away before we even start. This is how some organizations end up with absolute messes when it comes to permissions, apps that they shouldn't have, access that they shouldn't have, access to systems that are decommissioned or in archival mode only, et cetera, et cetera. All that is a massive risk to your organization. So the first thing, if I was approaching a Zero Trust project, and really important for when you go to the market or vendors to talk to them about, you know, how many people are you managing? How big is the user base, right? You need to know the machines when we start having the endpoint discussion, but we certainly need to know from a licensing perspective how many users we have in our environment. And do not for a moment neglect the various contractors that you might have in your organization. If they have access, it needs to be part of your strategy for Zero Trust identity. If you exclude some from this, then you will not be achieving that first step on your journey of Zero Trust. So visibility becomes the first key. Know who is working in your organization and what role that they have. right? And one of the best ways to do that is to either automate or get that information dumped into your IT systems. So again, the first step, talk to the human resources people. Find out what kind of information system they're using to track employees. And I hope to goodness it isn't an Excel spreadsheet, because if it is, you might have a really rough time moving forward with a Zero Trust identity management strategy. And as I said, automation. Now, automation is a key deliverable of Zero Trust when it comes to provisioning access. So account creation or account enables, linked to 2FA and SSO, single sign-on, and multi-factor authentication. I still call it 2FA because I'm old. And then account removal disable, again, removing access to FA and SSO licenses that you might have purchased when you're removing accounts. Of course, having an archival system or even a generated ticket that includes all of the steps, right? Like you could link the account provisioning to something like Managed Engine, and it can generate all of the different tickets. And in some cases, it can be even linked to execute those type of steps, automatically, if you will, with scripting or other software, for instance. But this is critical because if you have your identities and visibilities on those identities, you should be able to now control and automate the provisioning required for a new user in a particular department, assuming a particular role. But the next step, even though it's automated, there is a necessity of orchestration as well. Now, this is because if you have gone through that maturity model of identity management, you have a role-based access control maturity so that shares and folders, whatever you want to call it, or access is automatically permissioned properly for that particular role in the organization, right? So if you're trying to control access to certain pieces of your infrastructure using something like Office 365 or SharePoint or certain directories on older applications where data may end up, you need to have those permissions granted properly through an RBAC mechanism. SSO provision is also really important so that when an organization, for instance, your role indicates that you should have Salesforce access or something like that, the SSO is automatically provisioned for that particular third-party application. It's critical that you get this right because what has happened in the past is organizations, departments have bought access to a third-party SaaS. It hasn't been integrated with the main identity management that IT controls, and so you have managers actually system and administrators for those SaaS applications. That's a terrible idea because A, they're not experts at it, and B, they might forget to deprovision accounts properly so as to reduce costs associated with licensing. So all of these types of automation discussions need to occur so that IT can once again regain control of potentially third-party applications that are super important to the business function, but they have zero visibility on how many licenses and what roles people have within those organizations. So if your eyes are starting to, bug out because you're suddenly realizing that this is a huge challenge, you're absolutely right, it is, because there's a link between the orchestration, the identity to endpoints, and endpoints to applications that needs to be considered when you start going down the road of visibility, automation, and orchestration to get to the holy land, if you will, of having a Zero Trust identity management solution, which I think is foundational. And if I go back to my initial slide in the Zero Trust model, once you have that, all of the fancy things that you're going to want in order to do endpoint hygiene, in order to establish controls that support your zero trust model, including things like microsegmentation, et cetera, these are other foundational things that are generated, if you will, from the identity. So knowing what is logged into what data they have access to, what applications they're allowed to run on what infrastructure and over what network connections, be it VPN, be it third party, or even being it inside the actual LAN if people are still going to the office, all becomes part of this entire strategy. And built around this strategy is going to need to be those controls for anomalous behavior. And the way to make sure that you can detect anomalous behavior is through making sure that identity provisioning and identity permissioning is all done through automation and orchestration. If you don't put those efforts in, the rest of this just becomes a really difficult exercise and you'll kind of regret it. So we'll just go a little bit forward here and get to my next slide. Perfect. So this is fundamentally one of the biggest problems that we have. Zoe Kravitz does not equal Zoe Kravitz. You can see that we're using a strange character called, I believe it is an umlaut, over E. And from a Microsoft perspective, from a Amazon Web Services perspective, those are two separate user IDs. So what does that tell us? At the very beginning, we have to be absolutely solid on standards, right, of what we're going to use for particular naming conventions. Now, this becomes a massive challenge in an enterprise organization where there are non-standard characters used in IDs in many, many different countries, including entire different language sets. Did you know there are 206 keyboard layouts supported by Microsoft? I did not until I did this research for this. But I went, yeah, that's going to be a problem because it may not work with all the SSO implementations. The hashes might be different as a result of the different letter and character sets that you have when passing them from a Windows environment into a different application. Multi-factor authentication may not like having these inconsistencies within the user base, and also some apps may not like it at all, especially in terms of what they need to pass through as an identity. We've all gone to those dumb websites that restrict you to a certain amount of character types with no strange characters in some bizarre attempt to prevent SQL injection, I'm sure. But essentially, they've made it impossible for folks that have non-standard keyboards in a lot of cases to pick a password that will actually work with their system. So the big question then is, if Ian is already overwhelming you with his tirade on identity management and the challenges of it, well, wait, things are about to get a lot more interesting for your organization. So according to Cloud Security Alliance last year, they dropped this little thing that says the average enterprise has 464 custom applications deployed. And even the smallest size organizations, those with 1 to 1,000 employees, had an average of 22 custom applications. So when we think about that, it is absolutely a considerable onerous to try and map those to see if SSO is even an option, depending on what those applications are, if they're in the hands of third party or if they are old client server. Because literally, I've been in enterprise environments where there are some systems that are accessed over SSH or a terminal system, and they only support 8 characters of a password. So there's going to have to be a way of truncating the long passwords that you have, translating them into something that the receiving application can have. This is where you absolutely need to engage with a vendor on trying to get this done properly, because there are going to be applications in your environment, I have no doubt, that are going to be an absolute challenge when it comes to hitting the promised land of orchestration and provisioning and all those kind of things. Quite simply, some applications don't have the APIs built into them to be able to pass that data. So what happens with those is you need to think about now aligning both digital transformation exercises within your company, but also you need to align it with how are we replacing this thing to make it part of our zero trust strategy. So this is where when somebody comes to you and talks about digital transformation and zero trust, the cold, hard reality of where we are today as enterprises, we got to heat map it out. That's why I put the heat map there. We have to figure out the ones that were the quick wins to get to zero trust in terms of identity and management, and then we have to have exceptional exceptions and how we're going to tackle them within an organization. Because, we live in a world where sometimes we find VAXs and AS400s still in production through a whole bunch of different middleware, if you will. We see this a lot in large-scale enterprises that have ERP solutions from 10 or 15 years ago. They can sometimes be a huge challenge and don't integrate particularly well with the latest versions of Active Directory and LDAP, and potentially introducing a security problem because they might need something crazy like NTLM v1 for authentication. So there are a bunch of challenges with protocols, a bunch of challenges with the various characteristics of applications that you have within your organization. So start with a heat map, talk to the digital transformation teams and the application owners, and figure out what the art of the possible is within your organization to move forward, because it can be an absolutely huge challenge. Right. So I've underscored how important IDAM becomes, and this is really interesting, and I put Toby Ziegler from West Wing up there because he said this perfect line, is that post hoc ergo propter hoc. After it, therefore, because of it. One thing follows the other, therefore it caused by the other. This is a cascading effect. If you get identity and access management right within your organization, you are going to enable your own success, because all of the other things that begin to happen within your organization will fall into line, and it will be easy for you to scope all of the other parts of identity management. What we're seeing now is, for instance, in what we call end-user computing, which is sort of like conceptually is a thing that sits on top of a zero trust environment. This is where within the application the data is held. And that is a fundamental way of controlling the data that application generates and processes, as opposed to what we do now, which is dump everything onto an Excel spreadsheet. So if we think about where we need to go, getting identity solid and then getting endpoints solid within the organization now allows us to focus on the other things, some of which are going to be easy, especially if you're in a cloud environment where the infrastructure is a shared responsibility. But if you do have on-premise stuff, infrastructure is still going to be a challenge, and you may even need to go to yet more vendors to start fulfilling out the rest of those requirements when it comes to looking at identity management. So how to win at zero trust? It's actually pretty intuitive, but I'm going to walk you through it. So we've talked about how we need to take a phased approach, and that starting with identity management gives us lots of quick wins as we get into the orchestration and visibility and automation capabilities. That's all part of a strategy for your organization. It has to be aligned with digital transformation. It has to be aligned with the other parts of moving towards more of a secure development lifecycle in terms of application development if you do that, okay? So part of it has to have an overall governance strategy, and that might sit within the project management office, or sometimes third-party consultants are come in. But the strategy is the reference document that says and will provide the actual funding for this initiative, okay? And again, no one does this to save money. This is not about saving money. This is more about trying to safeguard our data and our organizations, because what we've previously been doing hasn't exactly brought us the success that we're looking for. So strategy is key. Then we need the data. So I talked about heat mapping the applications. I talked about bringing in a single source of truth, which should be the role within your organization, in order to match that with the applications that could go through the automation and orchestration piece. So data and visibility are sort of synonymous with each other. Then we have a plan to do this. Now, that plan is going to require multi-stages of this zero trust framework to be implemented while you go along. So, as an example, if you're going to provision an application through the Active Directory, for instance, you need to have that app published if the person is supposed to have access to that app, right? So you can kind of split it up, but really the thing that we want to have is that when I choose that this person is a payroll clerk, automatically those apps are either pushed down through Active Directory or some other application packaging mechanism to that particular user. They open up the application, and then seamlessly, because you've enabled SSO, the application logs in. We need to get away, of course, from the applications that have their own identity database. And that's part of that whole strategy for your organization that really needs to happen at the procurement level. So now we have another group that we have to talk about to see if it's even capable of being able to be enabled for SSO, and if your solution at the identity management level has that multi-factor authentication to protect the organization, because the new threat landscape for SaaS and the new threat landscape for third party is all about multi-factor authentication and not about what we used to consider password hygiene. Now with the technologies that are out there, brute force passwording without any sort of compensating controls is trivial and can be executed on all those people that bought a huge amount of video cards for Bitcoin mining can now become password crackers. So keep that in mind. The threat model really changed. Comprehensive plan is required. The biggest part about planning is not actually some Excel document or some sort of like calendar entries on what you're going to do. It's the communication of the plan to the people that are impacted and what you're trying to drive forward, okay? People don't like change in the environment. People even hate surprise change more. And so when you're starting to look at this, everyone needs to understand kind of conceptually what the Zero Trust framework is, what is the business value is going to be, why we need to start moving in this direction, and how we're going to do it. Your plan needs to be comprehensive, and a version of it that, is highly technical, right? But there needs to be a version of it so that the common person will understand it. So, for instance, moving forward, those of you that already have the payroll application, there will be no change to your experience. However, you will find that when onboarding new personnel, they will automatically be provisioned with the payroll application and should have the appropriate permissions within that application already granted through our Zero Trust identity management solution, okay? And that's asking a lot of things to line up and function properly. So you're going to need a test lab. So plan on having a test lab to start doing this and taking these various vendor products for a ride in order to see how far you can go with it within your application environment and how you're going to tackle the red ones, right? Execute. So this is the type of thing where now it comes, it's been tested, it's been signed off, you're now going to roll it out. Please tell users about it, that they might notice some strange behavior, they might notice some new screens. Otherwise, what you do is you end up blowing up your own help desk by people saying, because everybody's on heightened alert for Russian global cyber war or what have you, they're going to panic, and there's going to be panic in the disco if there's any changes, and the help desk will ring off the hook. This is an important aspect to enterprise, where there's no longer your ability to manage things and manage things that go wrong at scale when you're dealing with thousands of workstations. So if you choose that you're going to, for instance, provision Microsoft Word as the first identity and access management, you're going to want to make sure that Word can be deployed properly into the enterprise environment, and then when a person clicks on the icon, they have the necessary permissions in order for it to run. Because if you don't, and your security stops it from working, you will risk the ire of senior people in your organizations, because you're going to be the team that broke Word for thousands of users. And surprisingly enough, people do indeed use Word in an organization. God forbid you decide to pick Outlook first and turn off everybody's email and force them to use webmail. You won't gain any excited fans from that. Now, so again, this is now moving into the lessons learned, where the background and the capturing of this kind of information of what the challenges were. And some of the challenges are those challenges where you're in the organization, but there's a dependency to run that particular application because it's a custom app that was built within your organization, and it may require an out-of-date version of a helper app like Java or an older .NET patch or something like that. So again, these are the ones that you can't touch. Can't touch this. MC Hammer, doing identity management. It's really important that those be turned red on that heat maps, instead of putting a lot of time and effort to look at trying to orchestrate them, only to find that there are dependencies on those that need to be provisioned first, especially when you're dealing with a new installation of it. So again, a package to support the package needs to be dropped and properly provisioned and permissioned as well, even if it's just a check to see that the appropriate permissions are in place, right? So that's sort of the high-level strategy. Now, this is my advice on kind of how to stay sane on this journey that you're going on. So again, when you're dealing with this, I didn't put this tip on there, but I really should have. You need to work with your vendors under identity management. And I will say, can you do all of this with Microsoft Hello and all of the Microsoft Active Directory components? You probably could, but man, is it going to be time-consuming? There's not a lot of ton of extra support when it comes to this kind of thing. This is why you need a vendor that you can work with on all of these particular challenges, mostly because they're going to have the knowledge and expertise of how they worked around an old version of Oracle, or how they worked around an old version of Salesforce on-prem in order to get their identity and access management controls for Zero Trust implemented properly. So again, mindset here and not blowing yourself up within your organization. So of two competing theories, the simpler explanation is to be preferred. I believe that's Occam's razor. The other one's Hallam's razor. But sometimes I get the two razors confused. But again, what this really is talking about is don't try and go down those rabbit holes of finding, the obscure when it may be an obvious problem. And this is why testing your theories within a test environment on test workstations is so critical. And then never attribute to malice that which is adequately explained by stupidity. We all make mistakes. I've packaged applications and thought I had done it correctly, and unfortunately, when the application was launched, not only did it install as a local admin on the box, it used a default user ID and password for access. Not my finest moment. But this was a long time ago, and I'm now at the point of my career is that if I'm packaging applications, something has drastically gone wrong with my future prospects. But I think, as we sort of go through this journey, when we talk about Zero Trust, and we can go a few slides back here and kind of end on a high note with sort of what I've downloaded to you, is that the actual strategy that you're going to have to adopt is that this is phase one of a big journey that you're going to go on. And it's an organizational journey because where a lot of things will happen is there'll be mergers and acquisitions during that period of time. So there will be new applications potentially introduced to your environment. We will be dealing with Windows 11 and all of the changes that Microsoft has in store for us, including Active Directory. And quite frankly, there's been a few folks that are very frustrated with Microsoft on Active Directory, especially in light of some patches that I think were talked about in Bleeping Computer today that should not be installed on domain controllers. Their security patches because they break a certificate relationship with workstations, thus preventing the workstation from logging in. Not particularly cool. So there is now an active market for Active Directory replacements as well. And I think, to sort of kind of talk about this, and we're going to open it up to some questions in a particular moment here. This is something that the organization has to commit to, and it will not be something that will the journey may never complete. They say it's about the journey and not the destination. We live in a dynamic world, either from the threat landscape, but within our own organizations as different strategies are unleashed by different CISOs, different senior managers, and of course the budgetary constraints that we may find ourselves in if inflation or other traumatic events happen within the economy. Again, we need to be able to turn this project on and off and not lose all of the momentum that we've built up in moving to Zero Trust and focusing on identity management first. Now, I know we've got some time left. I went a little bit quicker than I normally would, so I'm happy to have Gladys and Victoria open it up to some Q&A questions. I know this was pretty high level and more around strategy than getting into the nitty gritty, but I'm happy to take some questions from our audience today.
Great. Thank you so much for that, Ian. That was a lot for our audience to chew over and mull over, and a lot of actionable ideas, too. So thanks for that really, really great presentation. And we do have a couple of great audience questions. I'll start with this one. It's a good one. I'm confused. Is Zero Trust a philosophy, a framework, a solution, or just best practices in IT? Is it really cybersecurity?
Yeah, that is an amazing question because, it can be all of those things and it could be none of those things. I think it depends on how you're going to approach it. I'm always wary of using the word philosophy because philosophy will then kind of potentially conjure up some bad behaviors. So if we talk about it as a framework of best practices along the lines of moving towards 100% visibility, 100% orchestration, 100% automation, it's really about looking at the vendor landscape and solving business problems, especially when it comes to things that we do over and over again that could be done more securely, that could take the element of human mistake out of that equation and move forward. I would call it more around best practices of IT because as a sort of sidebar part of this discussion, Microsoft now believes, especially with their sort of new approach to endpoint management, that IT is security and security is IT, and that they've converged, and that you can't really do IT without security being a factor anymore. So I think it's really interesting to sort of think about, it is almost, if I could be blunt, it's almost sort of like a trail that has signposts along the way. To look at it from a metaphorical journey, if you will, for your organization. So again, I don't think any one vendor will be able to sit there and say we can provide you zero trust, nor can a company, even though Forrester has asserted that they can certify your team as zero trust. I don't think zero trust would work well as a philosophy within a team because they'd never trust anyone and wouldn't work as a team. So a little joke there. But I think that it's really around how you're going to implement this sort of new framework, which I think is probably the best way to describe it, as you digitally transform your organization or as you life cycle your organization. You're going to start adopting some of the areas that we've discussed today along the idea of visibility, orchestration, and automation.
Great. That actually kind of leads me to my own question. I'm sorry, I'm breaking the fourth wall here by asking a question when I'm supposed to be moderating. But so a lot of the readers, the IT audience that are readers and that we've spoken to, a lot of them ask how they can get their C-level people to take zero trust seriously when it's not explicitly product-based. It's not something that can just buy, that it is this framework that they have to work on, as you said. What's the elevator pitch for them to get the higher-ups to take it seriously and act on it quickly?
I think when we look at where we're struggling today with just like throwing more security at it, and spending that kind of money at the particular IT challenges and security challenges we're having, it's a bit of a fundamental, let's think about building a new foundational approach to the way we do IT so that security is easier, it's more effective, and it's better return on investment. And it is a bit of a way of aligning sort of IT objectives to security objectives, rather than having potentially IT at loggerheads with security over budget spent. And I think when I look at a lot of enterprise architectures today, they haven't set themselves up for success. They've got a million different solutions running within their organization, and there is very little resiliency when 2 or 3 key individuals leave. There's half a dozen systems that nobody really knows how they work. And so I think when I look at how to build resiliency, especially around identity and access management, rather than having a bunch of really expensive IT resources that are like years and years and years in Windows Active Directory, that might not be an option for the company. And so turning to a vendor solution that has, the support behind it, the training on the use of the product, et cetera, in order to maintain, robust identity and access management, that might be a more viable solution. And so I really think that what we're trying to do here is like rebuild almost while the business is in flight, to try and get a better value and a better security experience. Because right now, it's really, what you discover each week that is, even more shocking than what you discovered the week before. And so I think there's this real stress associated with that, and it has, in many cases, limited the business to expand and thrive when they're constrained by the foundational IT that in some cases goes back into the 70s and 80s.
Right. Great stuff. Thanks for that. And then here we have another audience question. What is the best way to implement zero trust to the cloud? I can imagine a lot of our listeners here are thinking the same thing.
Absolutely. And so, obviously, the first part of it is, okay, are you going into space that there's a co-responsibility of ownership, right? So the first thing is if you're using Amazon or Azure or something like that, is to understand what you need to do and what is being done for you by Microsoft, Amazon, or Google, or whatever provider you're using. The next is to go to the marketplace and find out what do we have in the marketplaces that we might be able to use in order to move closer to zero trust and automate a lot of the access controls and provisioning, right? And authentication. Of course, multi-factor authentication being the first solution that you can use to ensure that valid users are properly authenticated to the cloud. And that is a fundamental of zero trust. Then there's other aspects to zero trust that come in terms of like where are we storing the data? Is the data secure? It's not in an S3 bucket open to the world. So there are a lot of ways to start achieving this. But I will say this, if you take a very vulnerable application and you put it in the cloud, it is not magically now invulnerable, it is still vulnerable. So you have to build a lot of layers around that particular vulnerable application and compensating controls. If you're going to move something that initially is going to be very vulnerable, you're going to need to look at that visibility component to make sure that you can detect anomalous behavior with regards to that application. Otherwise, you might be doomed from the start. You've just taken the problem and now moved it to a different location and haven't really improved it. So again, it may not be appropriate to move that application until there are more robust controls around it are in place, right?
Right. Speaking of doomed, here's another question from an audience. The audience member. My company has a number of regional HR officers, so it sounds like I might be doomed for zero trust, identity, and access management. Can you explain how I might work with what I have?
Yeah, so assuming that we actually have Windows Active Directory with trusts set up between those regional HR offices or officers to do the administration, we do have the ability then to drop in a vendor solution. So you can kind of get to that. The other way is to sort of go towards using the Microsoft or even things like secure web gateways in order to authenticate your users. So when we talk about zero trust when it comes to identities, what we need to establish is how are we going to push those identities to a single repository, or if there are multiple repositories, how are we going to link the APIs from a third-party solution to do that automation and orchestration piece? This is the kind of challenge where you do want to look at, vendors. You're going to interface with IT, and you're going to have to understand the data. And it may be possible that due to constraints in terms of like data privacy, for instance, that some countries in terms of their personal information cannot be sent outside. You may actually have to have separate sort of like and isolated solutions that are appropriate to one particular region or country. So that's the type of data segmentation that we talk about later on, where we need to protect for compliance and regulatory reasons identities for the company that are working in, say, the European Union or in countries that are especially concerned about sensitive data like Germany, Saudi Arabia, and other countries where you're not allowed to take that information outside of the country.
Right. And then one more question. You talked about archiving old user account data. Can you explain why that may be necessary and how that might work with third-party SaaS?
Yeah, so this is a huge one. So as an example, you need to have a deprovisioning process. As an example, you have a sales team member, and they do a number of deals. Everything is fine. They leave the organization, and they move on, okay? Back in the old days when we had Exchange servers, when they moved on, we still had their data. But when we deprovision their account on Office 365, that data, unless you're paying for archiving, may not be available to you anymore. So it's critical that you have a process that allows you to retrieve that data should that employee leave the organization, because what happens if that if your organization is subject to litigation or regulatory scrutiny and you need to perform an e-discovery function, if you no longer have that data, it's not going to go well for you. So there is a fiduciary requirement to retain that type of data within your organization. And this is why deprovisioning, especially email accounts where there's been deals brokered, and to getting to the truth of the matter is absolutely critical. In some other cases where you are moving systems from one to another, there may be requirement for you to look at archival data about your organization for whatever reason. And if you are migrating systems, you need to ensure that you're at least archiving the old data from that old system in a format that you can gain access to should you need to. It doesn't necessarily have to be on live platters, but it should be, some cases burned to a DVD or even placed on a USB stick and archived from the old system. And then, of course, the whole deprovisioning issue around licensing also comes into play here, because I know of many organizations that had decommissioned systems, had actually turned off the servers, but had been gleefully renewing their licensing each year for many years after the system was no longer needed because of a disconnect in their decommissioning process and not telling the accounting department or the accounts payable department that system was no longer available. So kind of a funny one and a great note to end on. This is why that automation component of deprovisioning becomes so important.
Excellent. Well, thanks, Ian. That looks like it's all the time we have for questions. We're going to take a short break, but we'll be back at the top of the hour for our second session, Zero Trust Implementation Tips and Techniques, led by Howard M. Cohen and moderated by Virtualization Review Editor-in-Chief David Rammel. So thanks, Ian, for a great session, to our sponsors, JumpCloud and Zoho, for making it possible. Stay tuned, everyone. We'll be back in a couple of minutes.
Okay, welcome back, everyone. Thank you for being here. And a special thanks to JumpCloud and Zoho for underwriting this summit and allowing us to bring you this great content. I'm David Rammel, editor of Virtualization and Cloud Review, here to moderate the second session of our summit called Zero Trust Implementation Tips and Techniques. Our speaker for this session is Howard M. Cohen, Senior Resultant at the Tech Channel Partners Results Group. Howard is a 40-year executive veteran of the information technology industry who today writes for and about the IT channel. He's a frequent speaker at a variety of IT industry events that include Microsoft Inspire, Citrix Synergy Summit, and many more. Also, he frequently hosts and presents webinars for many vendors and publications like this one, and I'm sure many of you have enjoyed his information-packed and entertaining presentations before. Howard, it's great to have you here. Please take it away.
Thank you, David. Thank you very much. And good morning, everybody. It is still morning for everybody, isn't it? Anyway, I'm Howard M. Cohen, as David said, and I'm here to talk to you about Zero Trust implementation. Those of you who have attended my presentations in the past know that I love to start every presentation with a word. And so here's today's word. Today's word is trust. Part of the title of what we're talking about today, trust is at the foundation of everything. Every relationship is based in some part on trust. Without trust, very little can be accomplished. So zero trust seems almost counterculture. But we're going to show you today how zero trust really gets us to a place where we can trust that everything's okay. First, I'd like to just jump back really quickly to President Ronald Reagan, who famously said, "Trust, but verify." Well, unfortunately, that's just not good enough anymore. Today, the adage is never trust, always verify. And if you think about it, once you have verified, you have very good reason to trust. You've verified. Okay, so we're going to talk about never trusting anything at any time and verifying everything about everything having to do with our network and its data. Before we begin that, I'd like to just travel back in time just a little bit. And actually just back to February of 2022, this year. And the folks at Gartner said that zero trust is an overused, widely misunderstood term used by many organizations. That's kind of like saying it doesn't really have a definition. Zero trust has been interpreted in many ways, and there are many different written definitions of it. It's definitely difficult to pin down. It's kind of like cloud. Cloud for a long time was hard for people to define. And in our industry, in IT, we have plenty of words like that. Look at the word partner is used in so many different ways. Well, zero trust is one of those. But if we just travel a little bit further back in time and go to August of 2021, the folks at Forrester published a practical guide to a zero trust implementation. If you'd like to read this, one of our sponsors, JumpCloud, makes this readily available at their website. So it may actually be available on your interface. I'm not sure, but definitely a worthwhile read. But August 2021, pretty recent, but why all of a sudden a practical guide to a zero trust implementation? And one more little pop back in time before that, we go to March of 2020, and yes, we're talking about the beginning of the global pandemic, the COVID-19 pandemic, which sent everybody home to work. And with everybody home from working, a lot of things changed. One of the things that changed was our threat surface. The threat surface is basically the entire area in which attackers can approach your network and try to penetrate your network. And typically, your threat surface is pretty much where you are, the building you have your people in, and the surrounding area. And that wasn't impossible to monitor. It wasn't impossible to keep scanning that, looking for possible anomalies. But then the COVID-19 pandemic hit, and the threat surface changed. Now it was every home of every employee that was working for your company. Each of those little parcels of land was part of your threat surface. You had to protect it. You had to manage it. And of course, all those folks were using their home computers or maybe their kids' computer. They were using residential internet service, residential quality firewalls, maybe. And so they weren't terribly secure to begin with, but your network was connecting there. Therefore, you had to make sure that they were protected. And of course, you didn't want to imagine going out to all of those homes and installing a firewall in each one. That's beyond comprehension. Well, back when we were all working in an office building or some fairly definable location, most people took the castle and moat approach to security. That is, they surrounded their physical space with a difficult-to-cross barrier. All right, looked a little bit like this. You had a firewall, and the firewall kept the internet and all that stuff outside, and you and your network inside, and protected you from all kinds of malfeasance. And that seemed to be okay. It seemed to be working. Now, however, we realize that literally everything is a potential threat. Not just people outside our network, but people inside our network as well. If we look at the statistics, take a look at the second listing here, 27% of compromises took place because of inadvertent misuse by an insider. Inadvertent use, that's a quarter of all the compromises coming from somebody inside doing something wrong, something foolish. Another 12%, which takes us up over a third, came from abuse by a malicious insider, somebody who was inside your firewall, inside your company, but wanted to take advantage of you. exploit your data resources, steal them perhaps, corrupt them. That's at least a third. So while you were looking outside for maybe 2/3, really a third of it was happening inside, and you weren't really protecting against that. There are other statistics that absolutely disagree with this. Let's say it's more like 75 to 80% of all exploits come from inside. So all your firewalls, all your intrusion prevention, it's just protecting you from a bare 10 to 20% of what's actually attacking you. That may be true. Those stats may be right. So today we're going to talk about implementing a strategy, a framework, an approach to security that is meant to be much more stringent, much more powerful, much more reliable than what we have today. And that is zero trust. At the core of zero trust, of course, as Ian said in the past hour, is identity and access management, identity security. We're going to talk about the process of implementing zero trust, starting with, as all good initiatives do, starting with an assessment, and then talking about the initiatives that will take place to actually put zero trust into place for us, talking about the importance of understanding your interdependencies, understanding your risks, and then creating a roadmap to a successful zero trust implementation. Let's begin with the assessment. Any good assessment should take an inventory of everything. It should take an inventory of your user community, of your applications, of your workloads, of the devices that are in place, of the network implementation that is there, the infrastructure that exists, the cloud services that you're using, everything. Take an inventory of everything so you understand what you're dealing with, what has to be protected, and what the implications are of any of that being breached. One of the best ways to do this is to model against a zero trust maturity model. Maturity models are very helpful to us. We've seen them applied to all kinds of situations in IT, but zero trust is a really good place to look at them because it talks about how well we're doing what we need to be doing. If you'd like to take a look at a really good zero trust maturity model, where better to go than the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency of the Health and Human Services Department of the United States government. This is the link to that. I'll leave it up for a few seconds so you can copy it down. CISA is the organization we all depend upon for a wealth of information about how to keep things secure. And this is what their maturity model looks like. Rather than have you strain your eyes to try to examine this thing, let's take a look at each level, each of the three levels individually, starting with the traditional level, where most people are right now. And unfortunately, it's inadequate. There's certainly passwords in place. Everybody uses passwords. Some people may actually be using multi-factor authentication. It's getting more and more widely adopted now that it's on your mobile device. It's easier to get at. Not a lot of people are doing the required risk assessment to understand what they're protecting it from, and what the implications are. Devices are barely interrogated at all. If somebody tries to connect to the network with a device, they try to connect to the network with a device. There's not really any network access control going on in a lot of environments. And so in many cases, the network management doesn't even know all the devices that are connecting. In the network environment itself, there's some big gloppy segmentation going on, but generally it's looked at as one big network. And encryption is not really used everywhere that it should be. Yeah, it's probably used in transit when you're transmitting information from one place to another, but not so much in storage. And therefore, that data is very vulnerable. Ultimately, the data isn't even inventoried. Most IT managers don't know everything that they have under storage in their network. They don't have the visibility. Now, that's not an accusation. I'm certainly not, indicting them. I'm just saying that this is typically where we find ourselves ending up when we haven't put any focus on the importance of network security or insufficient focus. Let's step up to those who've taken the first step and advanced their utilization of the network. They are definitely using multi-factor authentication everywhere. They're using identity federation now that they're using different cloud services as well as on-premise elements. And so they're formalizing the connections between the different entities through federation. In terms of devices, those devices have to comply now. They have to have adequate security. They have to be configured properly. There is network access control looking at them and making sure that the device that's trying to connect is capable of connecting properly. The network itself now has some better segmentation based on data coming in, data going out, and there's some analytics being done to make sure that that's working properly at all times. In terms of applications and workloads, now authentication is based on directory management. It's centralized, and so there's much more formality to it. It's actually easier for network managers to control because they're controlling it based on roles rather than individuals. It is quicker and easier for them. And they have implemented some level of least privilege access. That is to say that everybody gets just what they need to get. They don't get full access to everything anymore. To put a point on it, they're no longer handing out admin passwords to everybody to make it easy to get on the network. As we all know, there are some companies that are still doing that, and it's horrifying, but it's out there. Now let's look at the objective, the model, the destination we're all looking for, which is an optimal approach to maturity here in our networks. And from an identity standpoint, they're doing continuous validation, constantly making sure that the person who signed on a while ago is still that person. They haven't walked away and been replaced by somebody else who saw an opportunity to jump on an empty computer. They're using machine learning to monitor the behavior of users so that when a user does something that's unusual for them, it's noticed and action is immediately taken to make sure that that user is who they say they are. The same is true for devices. They're constantly reinterrogating and making sure that the device that originally logged in is still the same device. Nothing's been done to it, and it's still valid for access to their network. In terms of segmentation, not only are they segmenting the network carefully so that they can control each segment separately, they're actually using machine learning to learn what happens in those segments so that if anything unusual happens in the segment, they can take action upon it quickly. At this point, all traffic, all data flow from one point to another is always traveling encrypted. And as a matter of fact, all data is encrypted in storage at rest as well. When we talk about applications and workloads, the automation of the workflow is part of the monitoring strategy that's constantly looking at the workload, making sure that it's properly authorized repeatedly throughout the session so that we can continue to have trust that we have verified who's dealing with us. And then, as I said a moment ago, all data is encrypted. And by the way, all data is visible to network management. And we'll revisit that shortly. Okay, so now that we have some sense of our risks and what we're dealing with, it's time to launch some of our initiatives to move towards zero trust. The first initiative is to identify the interdependencies between workloads, data entities, devices, the network itself. There's a concept in cloud-native programming called coupling. We talk about things being loosely coupled or tightly coupled. When they're loosely coupled, it basically means that anything happening on one part of the equation doesn't necessarily take down the other part of the equation. You can have terrible things happen on some elements, but the bulk of the network continues to function until that problem is resolved. We prefer to have as few dependencies as possible, but the reality is that there is a great deal of interdependency, applications talking to applications. Remember that we live in the age of APIs, application programming interfaces, where every application talks to other applications. They all share data. They all work with each other. That's part of the power of working in a cloud environment. And so we need to support it. We need to understand what the interdependencies are so we can properly support them. We need to understand all of our risks, the risks in terms of the data itself, the privacy of our information, so that we know that sensitive information is not shared with those who should not have access to it. BYOD is another issue that still rears its ugly head even today. When somebody brings their own device, there is still insufficient interrogation of those devices at any given time. And so we need to be very careful. BYOD is great if you're practicing the appropriate level of care to make sure that every device is valid for authorization. And we have to worry about the risks due to penetration. Somebody from outside the network meddling inside our network. We have somebody phishing here. That's to indicate that that's the most popular way to meddle in our network, is to go phishing. And we'll talk about that in a moment shortly as well. Okay, so now that we've gathered a lot of information, now that we have a better understanding of our risks, our interdependencies, what's on our network, what we're trying to achieve in terms of our maturity, it's time now to roll out our Zero Trust roadmap. And to do that, the steps along the path are identity management, workload management, device management, network management, data management. You've probably seen that sequence before. I also want to talk about people and culture and how they impact your Zero Trust initiatives. Let's start with identity. It's been said several times this morning. We'll say it again and again. Your choice of identity and access management platform is perhaps the most important choice you will make. You need to make sure that it adequately and thoroughly identifies who's trying to access the network, that it tests them repeatedly to make sure that they are who they say they are in many different ways. Strongly recommend that you automate the process of onboarding and offboarding users. Say that because any human process is subject to failure. We're not perfect. We don't do everything the same way every time. We're not consistent. We may leave steps out. We may speed through certain things. On the other hand, an automated process will execute every step flawlessly. And therefore, when somebody is onboarded, they will be given all the information they need. It'll be confirmed that they have read and understand the information. They will have all of the different passwords and other credentials they need, and so forth. In terms of offboarding, even more important, when somebody leaves the company, they've got to be removed from the network. There are tons of stories of people who remained on their company's network years after they left and did all kinds of nefarious things. You don't want to be victimized by something like that. And it certainly isn't zero trust. That is ultimate trust. I'm trusting a former employee with my network resources. Horrifying. Yes, multi-factor authentication has become a requirement. It's table stakes. You've got to have it. And there are multiple different ways of achieving it. Not just a code number coming back on your mobile phone, but specific applications that connect you to your network and make sure that you are who you say you are and then allow you to actually access the network. This is all part of conditional access. We talk about conditional access a great deal. Conditional access is basically the great if-then statement of identity management. If this person is on this kind of device or this kind of device, then that's good. That's one step along the path. If they are in this location or that location, that's a step potentially that might be included if you don't want users accessing from anywhere other than their office or maybe their home. If they have the answer to certain questions, if they have an application that they can indicate their confirmation on. There's all kinds of ways of putting conditions onto the access, but you must. Especially because, as we'll mention later, passwords are going away. Now, speaking of passwords, single sign-on is still extremely popular in some quarters. Some network managers still just don't feel that single sign-on makes sense. Instead of having to get hold of multiple passwords, a bad actor can simply access that one password and gain access to everything. Obviously, good single sign-on solutions get past that and protect against that, but you get ranging different opinions about that single SSO, not SSI. Sorry about that. And directory management has also become pretty much table stakes, even in the smallest networks. You'll see more and more directory management solutions emerging beyond the ones that are extremely popular today. And that competition will be very, very healthy. Okay, so we've talked about a lot of different ways to make sure that the person who is trying to access the network is who they say they are. We also want to make sure that we can trust the workloads that are on our network. And the first step along that path is visibility. We need to be able to see every workload, see where the code is, see where the workload, the data is, see where everything is. We also need to see all of that in context to make sure that it's where it's supposed to be, doing what it's supposed to do to achieve the ends it's supposed to achieve. So we must always look at our resources in the context they're meant to be in. Strongly recommended that we use role-based access control. I alluded to this earlier. If you've got thousands of users and a change needs to be made, try to imagine visiting thousands of different objects in your directory management and making that change on each one. Far better to assign each individual to a specific group that really defines their role. So people who are in the accounting area are in the accounting group. People who are in operations are in the operations group. People who are in manufacturing are in the manufacturing group. Sales in the sales group. That's a big, large, broad set of groups. You can certainly have more granularity than that. But when you have to make a change in several groups rather than thousands of users, it's far easier and far less likely that you'll make mistakes or leave things out. So we're very strongly behind role-based access control. And the other thing about workloads, if you're going to manage your workloads on a platform or with tools, I would choose a platform. What do I mean? A lot of us, especially a lot of engineers, like to use specific tools to do various and sundry things. If they have a dozen tools in their toolkit, that's a dozen tools you have to trust. And we're talking about zero trust. So I'm not so happy trusting a dozen different tools. At the same time, integrating those tools so that they work well together is always, at the very least, difficult. Not impossible, but it adds a level of complexity that you simply don't want to have. So a platform that brings together all the functionality you need to properly manage your workloads is far preferable because all the functions are integrated. they're all meant to work together. They're all meant to be used together, so training and support are far easier and less expensive. There's every good reason to focus on finding the best of platforms rather than the best of breed individual tools. And that brings us back to devices. Again, you're going to see the word visibility over and over again. If you can't see it, you can't manage it. Just that simple. You must be able to see what you're managing. And in the case of devices, you need to be able to see the device and its configuration. You need to be able to see everything you need to know about the device. You need to practice very strong device access authorization, which means you have to know what's going on inside that device to make sure that it is secure enough, to make sure that it is adequately configured and robust enough to access your network. That's easier when you're talking about user devices than when you're talking about Internet of Thing devices, userless devices. And by the way, since 2008, according to Cisco, there are more IoT devices on the network than there are users. That's 14 years. So userless devices are in the majority. And the problem, of course, is that you can't reach out to a user and tell them to stop using that device. The device is a sensor. It's a control. It's a switch. In most cases, it's poorly configured. It's low power. The network that it's on is kind of lossy. It doesn't have the best software because it only has limited firmware space to store that software. There's all kinds of reasons that you have to be very wary of your IoT devices and provide multiple layers of additional hardening to secure them. You may have to put a local controller into place to have all those devices connect into before the backhaul to the internet or to your local network. It's crucial if you're deploying IoT to think security, think zero trust. You see that thing over there? I don't trust that thing. That's got to be your mantra when it comes to the IoT. Same is pretty much true for mobile devices. Mobile devices are not completely within your control. They come on the network, they go off the network. When they're on, you have to see that they're on. You have to see how they're configured. You have to see how they're secured so that you can know, you can verify that they have authorization to actually connect to your network. And even once you've proven it to yourself, prove it to yourself again. In terms of stationary devices and mobile devices, actually, you have to be concerned about patches and updates. Many of you manage your patches very carefully. You assess each patch that comes out to decide whether or not it should be applied in your environment. That's great. Whenever a patch or an update is applied, you're going to need to be scanning everything again and make the assumption that it wasn't applied properly in every case. That's the zero trust philosophy. And so you don't even trust the patches and the updates that take place on your own network. And while we're talking about networks, you need visibility of your entire infrastructure, all of it. You need to be able to see an infrastructure map, preferably created through your software, that shows you every node that's actually existing out there. Not something that was drawn based on what we think is out there, but something generated that shows you, here are all the nodes. And if there's something on there that you can't identify, immediately take action to either remove it or identify it and then verify it. And when I'm talking about infrastructure, I'm talking about both in the core, where all the action happens, and out at the edge where the users are and the IoT devices are. You have to have visibility of all of that. And now we're starting to talk about an enormous number of devices. We're talking about moving to a namespace that is a gajillion times larger than the namespace we use now. So it's anticipating that there are going to be an insane amount of devices out there that we're going to have to be careful of. And to ensure the network is to ensure the functionality of all the devices that are on it. Biggest recommendation we can make here is that you begin to really look, even if you have segmented your network, how can you segment it further so that you have very, very defined boundaries around each functionality, and that you can manage each one as a segment unto itself. It is certainly easier to manage a few hundred devices in a segment over tens of thousands of devices across the entire network. The operant word here is focus. If you can focus on it, you can see it. And if you can see it, you can verify it. And so that's a big part of the zero trust philosophy. The most popular way, of course, of segmenting today is to create virtual local area networks. That's still true to this day. We expect to see a lot more. But if you don't have VLANs defined yet, it's time to start talking about it. It's time to start talking about how do we define the boundaries of each segment of our network so we can look at each segment individually. Not for nothing, but there may come a day when you want to knock an entire segment off the network to insulate the rest of the network from a disaster that has suddenly broken out inside that segment. The more capable you are of doing that, the more protected your network environment can be. We talked a moment ago about best of platform. When you're looking at platforms, one of the things to remember is that it's not enough anymore to simply detect and identify a problem. It is expected that the tools, the platform you use, enables you to detect an anomaly when it happens, identify what the anomaly is immediately, and then the tools are right there to immediately go about fixing it. The thought and the action being the same thing. You must be able to very rapidly address the issue, resolve the issue, and protect everything about your network. This is an improvement over past platforms where one was responsible for identification and a whole other set of tools was used to resolve the issues. This is all coming together now, and it's important to look for platforms that will enable you to do that so that you remain competitive and you can preserve an effective zero trust environment. At the end of the day, everything we do is all about the data. And you know exactly what I'm going to say first. All of your data must be visible to you. You must be able to see all of your data, where it is. Is it stored at the proper level of storage? Is it stored for rapid, frequent access, or is it stored for long-term storage? Is it properly stored? Is it properly protected? Is it healthy? There's all kinds of things you want to know about your data. They should be at your fingertips. You should always be able to answer any question that anybody in upper management asks you about any of your data entities. It should not be something you have to take a lot of time to research. So set that as your model. Rapid answers to questions about any data entity. You want to always know the value of every data entity so that you know that the cost of the protection you're providing is aligned with the value of the data you're protecting, so that you're not accused of overspending or underspending to protect your valuable data assets. I can't say this enough. You must always keep your data encrypted. I've said it several times already. Say it again here. Data must be encrypted not only in transit between locations, but also at rest and storage, because cyber criminals can penetrate and get into your storage and corrupt your data and hold it for ransom. Or they can steal your data. Or they can simply corrupt it so that you can't use it anymore. There's all kinds of things that they can do, but if it's encrypted, a lot of that gets taken away from them. And of course, data backup is your best protection. If you have an available data backup, no matter what happens to your data, beyond encryption, data backup is your last line of defense. We're all, at this point, almost everybody is in some kind of hybrid environment. Most recent stats I saw were that 90% of organizations are hybrid. 80% are multi-cloud. It's all got to be controlled by one central directory service that you've chosen, that you've implemented, and that you have total visibility and total control over. It may be the popular flavor, or it may be one of the new entries into the market, but you've got to put it through its paces, evaluate it, verify you can trust it, and then put it into place to control all of your data entities, all of your users, all of the objects that are being managed on your network. Bottom line, and this is a famous old adage, know your data. You have to know what's going on with your data, know what it's for, know what it should look like, know how it should be configured, know everything about your data so that when something goes wrong, you know it immediately. Don't trust that the data is healthy. Don't ever trust that the data you have in storage is just fine. It's not. Somebody has already damaged it. Go make sure. That's zero trust. Okay, we've covered the ground that I would think most any analyst would cover in talking about zero trust. And now I'd like to go just a little step further. And that is to say, let's talk about people. People are a very important part of this conversation. People, your users, want an environment. They want an environment that's secure. They want everything to be secure, but they also want it to be frictionless. That is to say, if they could get on without entering a password, without retrieving multi-factor authentication, boy, that would be so much better, because they would be able to just get right to work and they wouldn't be hassled with all of this stuff. But the fact of the matter is, we all know that it all needs to be very, very secure. It's important now, when talking about users, that we apply a policy of giving each one the fewest privileges that we possibly can. Only give each person access to what they should have access to or need to have access to. And the more you can control that conditionally, the better off you are. I said it before, people used to give everybody admin passwords to their networks. Horrifying. But it's still true today. You've got to go the other end of the spectrum. Remember also that passwords should be retired completely, because people are not good at it. People are not good at forming complex, secure passwords. They're certainly not good at remembering them. And so they're going to have to use some kind of device, usually a Post-it note, on which they write their password and stick it under the keyboard or stick it on the side of the monitor. This is not uncommon. This is still going on today. People will write down their passwords and stick them somewhere where they can refer to them quickly when they need to log in. You need to get rid of that possibility. And the easiest way to do that is to simply stop using passwords and start turning to multiple factors other than passwords. And they are becoming more and more available. Remember that the most frequent exploit, the most frequent attack that is taking place in the IT world is based on social engineering. That is ransomware. A phishing attack takes place. What is a phishing attack? Somebody sends your users an email that looks genuine, but you can't trust that. You must have zero trust of every email that enters your environment. You must assume that it's not from who it says it's from, and you must find a way to prove that it is. Because if it isn't, more often than not, if the user clicks on a link there, or if they open up an attachment on that email, then they are going to open up the doors to all kinds of malfeasance, all kinds of disaster, most usually a cyber criminal encrypting your data for you and then not giving you the key so you can't get at your own data unless you pay a ransom, significant ransom. This is horrifying. And so when we talk about zero trust, it absolutely extends to email and anything else that's going to connect to your network through a human being. Remember that the best engineers refer to the worst segment, the least manageable segment of their network as being the point existing between the keyboard and the chair, PEBCAC, the point existing between the keyboard and the chair, the user. That is the most difficult segment of a network to manage, and therefore we have to be extremely careful. And finally, we talk about culture. This is Nicole Willis, who is the CTO at the Office of Management and Policy, Office of the Inspector General for the Health and Human Services Department of the United States government. And at a recent ATAR breakfast, she said, it's not just a technology change we're doing. Cultural change efforts and changing our communication. Cultural change from the top down, change that is endemic to the organization. The organization needs to adopt a universal culture of zero trust when it comes to your networks and your data. Remember that 85% of breaches taking place today contain a human element. Not surprising given that ransomware is so prevalent. The cost of a breach last year, on average, $4.25 million. $4.25 million. And some of that, some say 20%, some say more, came from external threats. A lot came from intentional internal threats, people inside your company who want to do bad things, and internal threats that were unintentional, mistakes that people have made. In the culture, you must remind people that everyone suffers when a breach occurs. That $4.25 million could have been better spent elsewhere in the company. Everybody in your company needs to embrace that, which will help them get to the place where they understand and embrace that cybersecurity is everyone's responsibility. Literally everybody in your organization must adopt a zero trust philosophy. And with that, David, do we have any questions?
We certainly do, Howard. And I would like to remind the audience that we can take questions up until about 5 minutes to the top of the hour in order to give you a short break before the next session. So please send them on in now. And let's get right to them. First come, first serve. Question from Jonathan. If you're federating all of the clouds and have a source of truth, what happens if the source gets corrupted or breached?
That's an intriguing question. That single source of truth is no different from any other entity on your network. And that is to say that anything that is valuable on your network must be backed up. So you need to identify a service that will back up even that single source of truth. Usually it's a directory service. And you need to have that directory service backed up somewhere, somehow, that you can quickly restore. And in a hybrid environment, that may mean a hybrid restoration. So it gets, in today's network, it gets a lot more complex. But literally, your only immediate solution for that single source of truth being compromised is to have an available backup that you can restore quickly.
Okay, next question comes from Chris in the audience. Do you advocate device access authorization for just email access through a platform like M365?
Give me the question again, David. I didn't get the beginning of it.
Okay, do you advocate device access authorization for just email access through a platform like Microsoft 365?
Advocate. That's an interesting word. In a position like mine, advocate is something you've got to be very wary of. because different environments have different requirements. If you're asking me, should I trust M365 as a source of authentication, it's not my first choice. I'm obviously a longtime Microsoft aficionado, but in most environments, the need to authenticate goes way beyond just email. Some people may put two layers in place. They're having you authenticate to M365 after authenticating into the network. I think that's clumsy. But I would rather federate and find a way to automate the process of using your core authentication to also give you access to M365 and other platforms like it. You need centralized control. And especially when you think about that, secure but frictionless issue, users don't want to be signing into everything. They probably don't even want to be signing into two things. So I think there are better strategies available to you.
Okay. Here's a timely question because some organizations are requiring their employees to come back to the office. The question reads, how will Zero Trust be affected when people go back and forth working from home and office?
Hopefully not at all. One of the conditions that you can use in a conditional access approach is location, IP address even. There's no reason why you can't, and this is, by the way, this has been available in directory services going back to the dark ages. You can condition access to specific resources based on location. Back in the day, if somebody was in the office, they could have access to a wider variety of resources than if they were on the road. And if they were on the road, operating remotely, they would have much more limited access. That strategy is still available today and should be taken advantage of in some cases. In the case of home versus home versus office, my feeling, and it's just a feeling, is that there needs to be parity. There needs to be equal access between home and office because what you have access to shouldn't be the arbiter of where you decide to work. A lot of people are seeing tremendous advantage having their people working from home. And it would be a shame if the network management department decided to change that. Difficult question. I think it's got to be answered individually by each individual company.
Okay. And earlier you talked about how users want a frictionless experience. And taking that into account, along with usability concerns and resources invested, this question asks, don't you feel Zero Trust is just a little too paranoid?
No. It's interesting because I get that question a lot. Zero Trust just seems so paranoid, so tight. The reality is that we live in a world where we let things go wrong. We actively let things go wrong. And when you think about $4.25 million per incident and the thousands upon thousands, think about the billions, trillions of dollars that have been wasted because of security exploits. There is nothing that can be considered too much to protect your data and the ability of your company to continue operating. I mean, personalize it. If you own a business, you depend upon the revenue from that business. If somebody out there decides they're going to ruin your day by penetrating your network and bringing your company to its knees, what do you feel would be too much to do to protect yourself against that person? I think that's where Zero Trust comes from. You can't just trust anybody. You really need to adopt a position that anything and everything could be a threat. And you know what? If you're wrong, good, terrific. But if you're right, you're protecting yourself. No, I don't think that's. I don't think it's paranoid. I think it's just reality in our environment today.
Okay, let's squeeze in one more question. And this relates to you bringing up the people element, unlike some other analysts do. The question reads, why do you think it's so important that Zero Trust be a cultural change, and what does that even mean?
What does that even mean? Okay, culture is a difficult concept to really grasp, because it's not something that you can readily change. You really can't just go ahead and change a culture. The culture of the company is the personality of that company. We talk about companies legally being people. Well, the culture is the personality of that person. It's how that person operates. It usually trickles down from the top. So if the CEO or chairperson of the company has certain values and certain beliefs, those tend to define the culture of the entire company beneath them. If they're benevolent people, it's a benevolent company. If they are vicious, heavily competitive people, it's a vicious, heavily competitive company. I think we can all think of companies that meet both of those descriptions. But when people embrace a culture and become part, it should be unavoidable in most cultures. When people embrace a culture, that's different than remembering a rule. Remembering a rule, yeah, okay, that's good. You remember it or you don't. But when it's part of the culture, it's kind of like breathing. You can't forget. It's just there. And it's not like somebody's pounding you on the head to remember. You yourself just can't forget that this is part of how we operate. We are suspect of everything until we prove to ourselves that it's trustworthy. That's a good approach to take to protect the company. So culture can be shifted, it can be influenced, but it can't be snap changed. It's got to be managed that way. And when it's part of the culture, it has a far greater likelihood of success.
Okay. It looks like that's all the questions we have time for. So thanks again, Howard, for a great presentation and answering all those questions.
Thank you, David. And thank you all for listening. I appreciate it. Hope to see you next time.